slaves obey.
Now, I don't know what caused that. I caught several of you as you came in this morning. Just a little word of explanation for our visitors. I have a day job, and my day job is as a judge, which most of the time means that I get to kind of stay out of the public eye, unless something really dramatic's happening. But it means that every 6 years I have to run for re-election. Now, you'll never see my name on the ballot. I'm thankful for that, because nobody's running against me. So I don't have to be on the ballot with, the Donald and Hillary this year, and I'm more than happy to have that not to be the case. But it's kind of an arcane process, and the process involves first declaring your candidacy, which I've done, and then waiting to see if anybody runs against you, which I've done. Nobody's running against me, that's fine. So my name will never be on the ballot. But there's another little arcane process, and that is I have to obtain a certain number of signatures of people who say, yeah, we think the guy should keep his day job. So, if you are a registered voter in Riverside County and you want me to keep my day job, and you don't want to see Mary and me standing outside of Walmart with clipboards, I'm going to put these right over here, and your signatures would be appreciated. No pressure. No pressure. Okay. Anyway, and a bunch you've already signed. In fact, I should have enough signatures already, but I just always rather have way too many than one too few. We're in the study of the Gospel of Mark, and we're in chapter 4, verses 35 to chapter 5, verse 43, as we talk about following Jesus through the Gospel of Mark. Today we're going to talk about followers' proof, the evidence on which we base our faith. When I was growing up, I always had side jobs. My dad always had side jobs. My dad had a printing shop, and he thought it would be character building for us to grow up working in that printing shop. I didn't think that was as character building as working in my granddad's office machine shop. He had an office machine business where we sold and repaired office machines. And so when I was 14 years old, I could tear down a typewriter, rebuild it, repair it, and I did it. And every day after school, that's where I was, and all weekend, that's where I was at his shop in downtown Waco, down Franklin Avenue. And then every once in a while, somebody would come in. I could tear down a typewriter and add a machine cashier. For those of you who are a younger generation, if you've never seen one of these, in prehistoric times, this is the way we used to print things. We didn't have computers and laser printers. In case you wonder why our keyboards on our computers are arranged like they are, they're arranged that way because of prehistoric typewriters, and that's the way the keyboards were arranged. Well, I could tear these things down, rebuild them, put them back together, but every once in a while, somebody would decide that he was going to fix his own typewriter. And I would get a box or sometimes a paper sack, and when I emptied the paper sack out, it would look like that. Now I could put it back together and I could make it work. But it was a whole lot more time consuming, and it was a whole lot more expensive for him to bring it to me like this than if he just brought it to me and said, here, this is what it's doing, can you fix it? And I could have fixed it. But that's the way we are as humans. As humans, we try to do the same thing. We try to fix everything, and we try all of our capabilities, all of our talents, all of our skills, And it's only when we get to the point where we realize we can't fix it that we finally say, Lord, help me. And so we bring the Lord this paper sack full of parts. And we say, put it back together. And unfortunately, the Lord becomes our last resort instead of our first resort. Well, Mark chapter 4, where we're looking at today, talks about 4 miracles that Jesus did. And they kind of point to the same thing. That people try everything in the world before they turn to Him, when He's the one who could have helped them at the very outset. Now, these miracles are designed to authenticate His teaching. If you remember, there's a theme in the book of Mark, and that is that actions speak louder than words. You've heard that expression, right? And that's the way this goes. If you remember 2 weeks ago in our last lesson in Mark chapter 4, we talked about some parables that Jesus shared. These are stories He told with heavenly meanings. He talked about the sower, and we spent time talking about the different kinds of soil. What kind of soil are you? And then He talked about the purpose of parables. And He talked about how the gospel's like a lamp, you don't hide it. And He talked about the seed that grows all by itself. And He talks about the mustard seed that starts out so small and grows to be a huge garden plant. And those are parables. That's what He said. What we're seeing today is what He did to back up what He said. Actions speak louder than words. So we're going to look at 4 miracles very briefly today to authenticate His authority to teach. And as I've said, we're going to read through the entire Gospel of Mark. Now, I'm using the Net translation. I like it because the translators actually tell you why they make some of their translational choices. It's not necessarily the best translation, but I like it because I know what the translators are thinking when they make particular translation. Mark chapter 4, verse 35 to 41, if you want to follow along. On that day, when evening came, Jesus said to His disciples, let's go across the other side of the lake. So after leaving the crowd, they took Him along just as He was in the boat, and other boats were with Him. Now a great windstorm developed, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was nearly swamped. But He was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. They woke Him up and said to Him, Teacher, don't you care that we're about to die? So He got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Be quiet, calm down. Then the wind stopped and it was dead calm. And He said to them, Why are you cowardly? Do you still not have faith? They were overwhelmed by fear and said to one another, Who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obey it. You've heard the story. The vivid details tell us that the person who's writing this, if he wasn't there, at least he had the description of someone who was there firsthand. Most people think that John Mark, after the death of Paul, was kind of Peter's protege. And so it's thought that Peter's the first-hand information that Mark is drawing from as he writes this gospel. Peter's on the boat, and along with the other of the 12 that Jesus had selected. Remember, a few weeks ago we talked about Jesus naming them as apostles, appointing them to be with Him, and then sending them out. Remember that? That's the group that's with Him on the boat. Now these guys, if you remember from the ones that Jesus selected to start out with, they're experienced fishermen. You've got Peter and Andrew and James and John. These guys, they spent every day of their adult life on the Sea of Galilee, which today is called Lake Tiberias. They're experienced fishermen. They knew what the Sea of Galilee was like. It's just a big lake is all it is. And here they are, frightened and overcome by a sudden squall that rises up. They're in the boat on the same lake they lived all their lives on. They're in their element. They're in their backyard. They know how to handle this boat. They know how to handle the lake. And yet, they're overwhelmed by fear. Now, it's hard to imagine, given that background, that they wouldn't have tried to exhaust every possible tool that they had at their hand to try to solve the problem before awakening Jesus. I mean, surely they tried every tool in their seaman's toolbox. They'd all been exhausted. I mean, what's this landlubber going to do to help us? The only time he's ever on a boat, somebody else is sailing it. But when they could find no safety anywhere else, they woke up this landlubber Jesus, and they asked his assistance in battling the waves. And he gets up, and what they learned in that moment is that no matter how skilled, no matter how experienced you are, no matter how much in control of things you may think you are, it's only when you come to Jesus that you can find safety. They needed to trust Jesus, and he proved that he was Lord over the seas. I read this quote. I like it. Safety lies not in our distance from danger, but in our nearness to God. Safety lies not in our distance from danger, but in our nearness to God. You see, the disciples are terrified, and their fear is unfounded. Incidentally, I find it interesting that Mark uses two different words for fear here. In verse 40, the Net Bible distinguishes between these two. In verse 40, it says, "Why are you cowardly?" And he uses the Greek word deilos, which means cowardly fear. But then in verse 41, after he's calmed the sea, you read this. They were overwhelmed by fear. The Greek word is phobos. And they said to one another, "Who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him." Phobos is paralyzing fear. You've heard of phobias? It comes from that word. It's paralyzing fear. Okay? And the point of that is that they were cowards, and then when they realized who Jesus was, that awareness was terrifying. It paralyzed them as they realized that they were in the presence of none other than God himself. If they just listened to Jesus' words, they wouldn't have had to been afraid in the first place. Remember how this all started off? Jesus said, "Let's get in the boat and go out in the middle of the lake and drown," right? No, that's not what he said. He said, "Let's get in the boat and go across to the other side." If they really trusted him, they should have known that nothing's going to happen with Jesus in the boat. But they haven't come along that far yet. Incidentally, about 20 years ago, 94 if I recall correctly was the year, a fellow walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee saw a piece of wood sticking out. And he and his brother spent several months uncovering that wood. And the more they uncovered, the more they had left to uncover. And eventually, this is what they dug up. Right there. It's been carbon dated. This is the hull of a 1st century fishing boat. This boat was on the Sea of Galilee in the day of Jesus. I saw it when I was over in Israel in 2014. They call it the Jesus boat. It's the centerpiece of a museum over there on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. So it gives you a sense of what the basic dimensions of the boat are. That's the kind of fishing boat we're talking about. And Bob and Lynn and I got to see it. What's the message of this particular vignette? If God can sleep through a storm, maybe we can too. Trust him before you exhaust all of your resources. Go to him first, not last. Okay, the second story is a rather long story, verses 1 through 20 of chapter 5. Jesus offers peace during life's confusion. So they came to the other side of the lake, to the region of the Gerasenes. Just as Jesus was getting out of the boat, a man with an unclean spirit came from the tombs and met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For his hands and feet had often been bound with chains and shackles, but he tore the chains apart and broken the shackles in pieces. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Each night and every day among the tombs and in the mountains he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him. Then he cried out with a loud voice, "Leave me alone, Jesus, Son of the Most High God. I implore you by God, do not torment me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of that man, you unclean spirit." Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged Jesus repeatedly not to send them out of the region. There on the hillside, a great herd of pigs was feeding. And the demoniac spirits begged him, "Send us into the pigs, let us enter them." Jesus gave them permission, so the unclean spirits came out and went into the pigs. Then the herd rushed down the steep slope into the lake, and about 2,000 were drowned in the lake. Now the herdsmen ran off and spread the news in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the one who had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demon-possessed man reported it, and they also told about the pigs. Then they asked Jesus to leave their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed asked if he could go with him, but Jesus did not permit him to do so. Instead, he said to him, "Go to your home and to your people and tell them what the Lord has done for you, that he had mercy on you." So he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis what Jesus had done for him, and all were amazed. Now, notice the difference in the way that the people in this particular story react. So far, we've seen the wind and the sea, and even the demons obey Jesus. But when we get to the end of the story, the reaction of the people in the territory is, "Please go away. Leave. We don't want you around here." Now, maybe they're more concerned about the fact that they've suffered this economic loss. I mean, a herd of 2,000 pigs, that's no small deal in that time. Incidentally, I remember growing up at a time when people said, "Well, what were they doing raising pigs anyway?" Because pigs were unclean animals. Well, the Decapolis is not necessarily a Jewish region, as we're going to see in a moment. So it's a mistaken assumption to say that these people are Jews. They're most likely Gentiles. But they don't know what to make of this guy. And they just want him to go away. Have you ever felt that way about folks? So you don't have to think about it, just please leave. Now there are two surprising features that surface in this little pericope. The first is the man asks to follow Jesus. Here he is. Moments ago, he was crying out, cutting himself with stones. The people have been trying to keep him shackled up. He's been roaming around among caves. You know, the parents are telling their kids, don't go out. You're beyond the city limits. That crazy man will get you. That kind of stuff. And now he's in his right mind, and he wants to follow Jesus. The interesting thing to me is that the words he uses are, he wants to be with Jesus. Now, remember the time when Jesus appointed the apostles? Remember that? And the text there, in chapter 2, verse 14 said, he named them apostles. He appointed them to be with him so he could send them out. The words that this man uses are the same words that Jesus used in saying, "You're to be with me." So what this fellow is saying is, hey, is there room for one more in your little band of 12? Do you have room for me? I want to join your group. And Jesus says no. Here's what he says to him. He did not permit him, but he said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. Now, Jesus doesn't tell him, "Don't tell anybody." Sometimes Jesus does it. Don't tell anybody. But he doesn't say that. He says, "Go home and tell the folks that know you what the Lord's done for you." Why would Jesus refuse to allow this man to follow him and then permit him to speak? Well, I think the reason is this. If he had gone with Jesus and the disciples, then whenever he was giving his personal testimony about what God had done for him, he would have to say something like this: "I used to be this way, but look what he's done for me." Now, what's the inherent problem with that? the folks he's talking to, they don't know that he used to be this way, right? When Jesus says, go back home, he's going back to the very people who tried to chain him and keep him contained and have been unsuccessful in doing it. So they could know, this is what he used to be, look what he is now. Do you see how testimony could be a much more powerful testimony? You know, if I were the guy, I wouldn't want to go back there. But that's what Jesus said. And lots of times Jesus has us go places to do things that we really wouldn't choose to do if we had our choice. What is this Decapolis anyway? Well, Decapolis refers to 10 cities. They were located to the east of the Sea of Galilee, along the eastern side of the Jordan River, and a little bit to the west of the Jordan River after you got south of the Sea of Galilee. The 10 cities had been excavated, and actually, these were Roman cities. What happened is, when the Romans would expand the frontier of their empire, they would build Roman cities at the frontier. And this was just their way of saying, this is our territory. All the cities, very interestingly, were built along the same pattern. You can go from one city to another, and you can't really tell which one's which if you don't know which one it is. They all have a major north-south street, a major east-west street, and they're laid out exactly the same. Bob and Lynn and I, when we were in Israel in 2014, actually visited one. It's called Scythopolis by the Romans. It's called Bet-Shan by the Israelis. And this is what it looks like. And that's what every one of those frontier cities look like in the Decapolis, the 10 cities. They're all laid out exactly the same way. This view is from the Acropolis, which is where all of the north-south streets, that the major street, that was the column street, they would lead to a mountain. And on that mountain is where they would put the temples of their gods. And so this is from the top of that mountain, looking down into the city and seeing that street that heads right up to it. But the point of this story is that these folks had tried everything. They tried chaining this guy. They tried kicking him out of town. Just like the storm. The disciples had tried everything. Nothing worked until they turned to Jesus. You know, it's hard to understand why we wait so long to turn to Jesus. But that's one of Satan's tools. He tries to make us do everything we can to solve our own problem before we ever go to the one who can solve them from the outset. Harry Truman said this one time, if you can't convince them, confuse them. And I think that's what the devil does. He confuses us because he doesn't want us to turn to the Lord and go to him first. And so he makes our lives spin out of control. You see, peace is not the absence of trouble. Peace is the presence of Christ. Just like safety doesn't depend on how far you are from danger. It depends on how near you are to Christ. Let him sort out your life and offer you peace. Now there's the third story. Jesus offers relief from life's pain, verses 21 to 34 of chapter 5. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him and was by the sea. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came up, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He asked him urgently, "My little daughter is near death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be healed and live." Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. Now a woman was there who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. She had endured a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she kept saying, "If only I touch his clothes, I will be healed." At once the bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Jesus knew at once the power had gone out from him. He turned around to the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he looked around to see who had done it. Then the woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. The first story we saw takes place in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. The second story takes place on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now they've gone back to the other side, to the western shore. They're back in Jewish territory. And in characteristic form, Mark kind of tells a story within a story. It starts out with this fellow named Jairus coming and saying, "Come quickly, my daughter's sick, she's going to die if you don't get there quick." And then on the way, this happens. This woman has been suffering from some kind of bleeding condition. We don't know what the condition was. But we do know this. It wasn't just a matter of physical ailment. It wasn't just a matter of pain. It was a matter of ritual uncleanness. And that was as important as anything else. You see, Leviticus 15, verses 25 to 27, lays down the law regarding ritual impurity that has to do with a flow of blood for a woman. And to say that she suffered for years with this condition means that, no, she's not a leper, but nobody's going to have anything to do with her. And the reason they're not going to have anything to do with her is because if you touch her, you become unclean. And you can't participate in the Jewish observances. And so that she wouldn't get invited to homes, she wouldn't get invited to parties, nobody's going to have anything to do with her. They're not even going to touch her to console her because they'll be making themselves unclean. Now, technically speaking, what happens when she touches Jesus, if Jesus was an ordinary person, is Jesus would become unclean. Have you ever noticed in the Old Testament, and the way things normally work, we've got that saying, an apple spoils the barrel. You've heard that saying, right? Okay. You put something that's defective along with other things that are not defective, and what happens is the defect spreads, right? Okay. It all gets reversed with Jesus. She touches him, and instead of him becoming unclean, what happens is she becomes clean. Amazing. She's tried everything. She's gone to doctors. She's spent everything that she had. It's not until she comes to Jesus that the problem is solved. But just like the sea, just like the demoniac, here's another case where I try everything in the world that I could try before I turn to Jesus. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Problem of Pain, wrote this: pain is not good in itself. What is good in any painful experience is for the sufferer his submission to the will of God, and for the spectators the compassion aroused and the acts of mercy to which it leads. Jesus is the one who shows compassion and mercy. What's the point of this story? You don't have to cope with pain on your own. Trust him to offer you relief through your pain. Trust him. Turn to him first. Now, the fourth story started out at the beginning of the third. Remember this fellow named Jairus? He went to find Jesus, to get Jesus to come and take care of his sick daughter. Well, Jesus now has gotten sidetracked. He's gotten delayed. And that delay means the daughter dies. While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue ruler's house saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" But Jesus, paying no attention to what was said, and told the synagogue ruler, "Do not be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the synagogue ruler, where he saw noisy confusion and people weeping and wailing loudly. When he entered, he said to them, "Why are you distressed and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they began making fun of him. You read this and you think, why in the world is Dad laughing? Dad's not laughing. You see, when a person would die, they had this group of professional mourners. They just kind of went from one place to another. doing all the crying and weeping and wailing over the death of someone. Those are the ones making fun. But he put them all outside. He took the child's father and mother and his own companions and went into the room where the child was. Then, gently taking the child by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. The girl got up and at once began to walk around. She was 12 years old. They were completely astonished at this. He strictly ordered that no one should know about this and told them to give her something to eat. He's on his way. He's going to get there before she dies. But that woman, she stopped him. She delayed him. And because she delayed him, the girl died before Jesus got there. And that's the message that comes to Jesus. I mean, Jesus had the power to calm the sea. He had the power to cast the demons out of that man. He had the power to heal this woman, but surely death is just too final. It's too late. Every resource is exhausted. No hope remains. And then, lo and behold, Jesus raises her from the dead. Maybe death isn't so final after all. We've got something that we say. God is good all the time. And that's true even in tragedy. There is no finality in this life to any tragedy when Jesus is involved. Have you ever experienced a tragedy? We all have. Have you found hope in Him to sustain you through that tragedy? I found this quote from Rick Warren. I like it. Happy moments, praise God. Difficult moments, seek God. Quiet moments, worship God. Painful moments, trust God. Every moment, thank God. And it all began with that little verse that we started out with. Because the same thing that applies to the wind, to the wave, the demons, and the woman, and this dead little girl. They were overwhelmed by fear and said to one another, who then is this? Even the wind and the sea and all these other things obey Him. We all either have had or are going through or will go through our own tragedies that are not unlike any of these that we've just read about. Oh, the technology may have changed as we go through the, sailing. Or, medicine may have advanced. But the stories are all essentially the same. And in every one of them, the message is this. Trust Jesus and go to Him first, not last. We can help you do that. Whether it's to come to Him in obedient faith or to come back to Him, we're going to sing a song. If we can help you, let us know how. If you want to come to the front, that's fine. If you don't, one of the elders is going to be standing in the back by that middle school classroom. Let them know how